if you plant something in between the rows of agave, that's going to impact the soil, and that's going to impact the growth of the agave, and that's going to impact the ultimate flavor of the mezcal. So if this palenquero, who isn't here right now, but either his wife or his kids will give us samples, etc., etc., if he buys the espadín from this farmer and he buys the espadín from that farmer, both plots of land have the same temperature, the same sunshine, and the same precipitation. This farmer plants other crops, that farmer doesn't. So this espadín will taste different than that espadín, even though they're virtually in the same microclimate,
right,
because of the way the land is treated by this farmer versus that farmer. And so one of the reasons why no two batches of mezcal, artisanal mezcal, are the same is that no two plots of land are the same, even though they might be in the same microclimate. I mean, beans, for example, give a lot of nitrogen to the soil, and nitrogen is going to impact the growth of this agave, and so the nitrogen is going to impact the ultimate flavor of this versus that. Okay, so this plant will mature probably within the next year or so, and that's when the stalk will shoot up. As soon as the stalk shoots up, you cut it off and you leave the plant in the field for anywhere from a couple of months to a year. And the reason that you do it is the plant, you're fooling the plant. The plant knows it's going to die and it wants to reproduce before it dies. So it's taking all the nutrients from the terroir, all the starches and the carbohydrates and the nutrients. It's taking them and sending them up into the stalk to produce babies and to produce flowers and seeds. So if you cut off the stalk, the plant still thinks it's reproducing, but all those nutrients have nowhere to go except into the heart of the plant, or the piña. And it's called a piña because when you take off the leaves, it'll look like a pineapple or an artichoke heart, which we'll see later on. Okay, so and you want as nutritious and carbohydrate-rich piña as possible. So if you cut off the stalk and leave it, you're fooling the plant, and all those nutrients go into the heart of the plant, which is what you want. So then you come back into the field a few months later, and then with a machete you cut off the leaves, and then with an iron tool called a koa, it's a round tool, sharp at one end, and with a mallet you cut the plant out of the field where the dirt meets the piña. Okay, and so you're not going to use the root of the plant to make mezcal, and you're not going to use the leaves of the plant to make mezcal. You're going to use the heart of the plant. Okay. And if it's a tobasiche or a madre quiche, see that behind us, that taller madre quiche, or tobasiche, it'd be called. It's a Karwinski. When you cut off the leaves, it'll look like a log. It's not going to look like a pineapple. It'll still be called a piña, but it's going to look like something else. Okay. The leaves are usually left in the field, and once they start to dry and they're not as heavy, other people will harvest the leaves, dry them fully, and use them as firewood. There are people that live off of the leaves of the agave. Okay, that's a large tobala. Now, certain species of agave, you have to shave off all the leaves, because if you don't, your mezcal will end up having a little bit of bitterness. And agave Karwinski is one of the species that you have to shave all the leaf. With espadín, you don't. And let's see if we can find, okay. Those are baked espadín. And you see it's still got some of the leaf. Okay? And the leaf still has carbohydrates, which are now sugars, and so you get a better yield if you've got a little bit of the leaf, and the leaf the pinca isn't going to lead to bitterness. He's shaving all of the leaf off of the agave Karwinski because he doesn't want to have the bitterness. Okay?
And that's the one that's also called Madre Quiche?
That's right, yes. Sometimes he is around, sometimes. So this is a good example of what the oven looks like before, when it's ready to bake agave. Before the firewood goes in, before the rocks go back on top, and before anything else is done. If you're making Mezcal Beneva, or if you're making Patron tequila, or Jose Cuervo, any of the popular brands of tequila, you're going to steam your agave in an autoclave, or you might use a different technique with something called a diffuser. But so you put it in a big iron tank, the piñas, you crank up the diesel, and you steam it for a certain period of time, and that's how you cook your agave. And that helps. The temperature at which you bake or cook or steam, and the extent of the cooking is going to ultimately impact flavor. If you're making artisanal mezcal, you're going to use an oven like this. So this is a conical pit that goes down 6 or 8 feet below where I'm standing. And you put logs in the bottom of the pit and light them. Then you put a mound of rocks on top of the logs. And after about 5 or 6 hours, the rocks are as hot as they're ever going to get. So you're ready to bake your agave. Okay? If you put your agave directly on top of the rocks, they're going to burn too much. So you want to insulate your piñas from the rocks. And everybody makes a mezcal a little bit differently. People don't tend to read a book about how to make mezcal. You learn from your uncles and your fathers and your grandfathers. So everybody's a little bit different. Depends on the family, okay? But one of the things that everybody that I know does is you put a layer of wet, discarded fiber from the distillation process called bagasso. You put a layer of wet fiber, so this used to be agave, on top of the rocks, and then you pile up your agave around the outside of the pit and on top of the bagasso. Okay, and this oven will hold perhaps 7 tons of agave.
Wow.
You try and put the bigger pieces closer to the heat source, the smaller pieces further away. And you want to try and get consistent baking. 100% consistent baking is never achieved. Some piñas will be cooked more than others. Some will be charred more than others. Occasionally there'll be a piña that you can't use because you've charred it too much. And that's another reason why no two batches are the same, because you don't have the exact same flavor, the exact same degree of doneness when you're making artisanal mezcal. It's an art versus a science. Okay, so you have your piñas, and then some people will put another layer of bagasso on top of the piñas. Some people don't. Some people will put a layer of a bundle of green acacia leaves on top. Most people don't. Almost everybody will put something on top of the piñas, either plastic like that, or a tarpaulin, or grain sacks that have been sewn together, or palm leaf mats. So you put something on top of the piñas, and then all this dirt gets shoveled on top of that. Okay? And you keep on shoveling the dirt on top of the big mound until there's no longer smoke escaping. The smoke escaping means something's coming out of the pit, and you want the pit to be airtight because you want those rocks to stay hot for several days. Okay, so you keep on shoveling dirt on top of the pit, on top of the mound, and if you didn't know what was going on here, it would just look like there's a big mound of dirt. Okay, so you've got your mound of dirt, and that's slow roasting your piñas. Okay, after about 5 days, you shovel off the dirt, you take off the other cover, and what used to be green, carbohydrate-rich piñas are now brown, baked, sweet piñas, okay? And it will taste them somewhere else later on. They'll taste like caramel or butterscotch or maple, so they've got a very, very sweet taste, which is what you want, okay? So where we are now, the piñas have been taken out of here, and they're fermenting, which we'll see in a few minutes. And the next time he wants to roast agave to make mezcal, he has to take off the bagasso by hand, throw out the rocks by hand, and what's going to be at the bottom of the pit? Charcoal.
Oh,
Charcoal.
of course.
Because it hasn't been burned down to ash because there hasn't been the oxygen burning it down to. And the charcoal is either sold, used by the family for cooking, or used as fertilizer to grow more agave. If you don't want to leave your agave out before it's been cooked too long because it'll dry out. So quite often you'll put a tarp over it so it doesn't dry out. Once it's baked, it can sit here for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and mold is forming. You can see green mold there, a little bit of orange mold, and the mold is not a bad thing. Some people say that it improves the flavor. Some people say it kickstarts fermentation, which I don't think it does because it's not a yeast, it's a mold. But the point is, this is moldy and it's going to produce good mezcal. This pile of baked agave was that high. There was a pile of pieces in the middle, and then there were little pieces here. So the horse pulls the wheel and crushes the agave. Then they put the agave in the wheelbarrow, and it goes up here, and then the wheelbarrow gets dumped into there. What you ferment in is going to impact the flavor, okay? These typically people use pine slat vats from 700 to 1,000 liters like are here, okay? You can ferment in a washing machine casing.
I'm sorry, Jay.
You can ferment in a plastic tub. In Michoacan, they often ferment in a pit in the ground lined with oak. Some people in Oaxaca still ferment in an animal skin extended from the ceiling. And again, what you ferment in impacts flavor. So typically what you'll do is fill up your vat about 3/4 of the way with sweet, crushed, baked agave. And you wait, again, everybody's a little bit different. Some people add some water now and then fill it up with water after a couple of days. Most people will just leave this until it starts to heat up a bit. They'll put their hand in, and if they think that it's hot enough, then they'll add water. Okay, so you stir it up with this, and you see it bubbling. And the bubbling is not boiling, it's the yeasts floating around that are interacting with the sweet baked crushed agave, causing fermentation. Okay?
Knocking CO2 off.
Yes, CO2 is being created. Now, what we have here is this is waiting to have the water added. A pasty cap forms on top, and it goes from a light brown to a darker brown. And then
When did they put the cross in it?
when the cap starts to form. Okay.
And that is in a sense it's a religious meaning. Is it blessing the?
Not too many Jews make mezcal, so you don't see many stars of David. Okay, it's superstition. It will give you a better mezcal, a better yield, and sometimes, usually actually, on top of the mound of dirt, which is the oven, you'll have a bigger wooden cross, sometimes decorated with bougainvillea leaves. Okay, it's superstition. Okay, so the bubbling stops, the pasty cap turns dark, and the stuff starts to pull away from the sides, and you can see it pulling away here. Okay, so this and this will be ready to distill. Okay, so step 1, baking like that is typical. Step 2, crushing by hand is atypical. Step 3, fermenting in vats like this is typical. And step 4, distilling in clay pots is atypical or ancestral. At February 23rd, a new regulation was passed dividing the types of mezcal you can make into ancestral, artisanal, and just plain mezcal. Ancestral, it's still, people are still trying to interpret it, what it means, but one thing we do know for sure is ancestral mezcal, you can use the horse pulling the tahona, you can crush it by hand, and you have to use clay pots for distilling. You can't use that machine to to create ancestral Mescal.
Okay.
Okay.
So you have to have all three of those components, not just one. Hand
Yeah.
crushing,
Well, no,
clay pot.
hand or the horse pulling the Tohona, clay pot, and baking in a stone oven or dirt oven over firewood and rocks.
Okay.
Okay. Artisanal Mescal, the typical is using the horse pulling the Tohona and a copper pot still. Okay. And then more the plain Mescal is usually steamed using an autoclave or a diffuser, fermenting in a stainless steel vat, having continuously running sophisticated stills. But what we know for sure is horse and Tohona, clay pot, and oven like we just saw to make ancestral Mescal.
Ancestral.
We have 4 clay stills that all work the same way. There's encased in brick and cement, there's a 70 or 80 liter clay pot. Okay? And behind you there's 2 broken clay pots. So there's one of those under here. And it's resting on top of it is a clay cylinder, hollow here and hollow here. Okay? And there's a hole underneath there. So he just keeps these, where you put the firewood, covered up when he's not doing anything so the chickens won't come in and lay eggs. Okay? Okay. So, to make Mescal, you'll put, everybody again is a little bit different, but you'll fill up the bottom pot with about 40 or 50% fermented liquid, and the balance will be fermented fiber. So the stuff that's in the tinas, the pine vats, gets put into here, liquid and fiber. And then we seal the cylinder to the pot on the bottom with that paste. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. And you put firewood in there, and the firewood, you heat, like the firewood, and the stuff in the bottom starts to heat up, causing steam. The steam rises. There's a piece of rope going down this far, attached there and there, and you would take a raw piece of agave leaf that would look more like this, only nice and green. Okay, and this is a piece of carrizo, and there's a hole in the cylinder. So we take the raw green agave leaf, put the narrow end in one end of the carrizo, and the wide end is resting on that piece, on that string. Do you want to take a look? Mm-hmm. Now, it would look different. Okay. Like the green, it'll look like a nice piece of green agave leaf. That's been used and it's not going to be used anymore. So we put the condenser on there. Using that paste, we seal the condenser to the cylinder. And we turn on the water. The steam, and we've got a continuous flow of water, cold water coming in through there and out through there. So this stays cool. Okay. The steam rises, hits the bottom of this, causing condensation, and the drops of liquid fall onto the agave leaf, and liquid comes out there. Okay? When he started making Mescal with his dad, like 40, 45 years ago, this was clay and this was river reed. So this is modern by his standards.
Wow.
Okay? So the object is, almost all Mescal is double distilled. So the object is to empty everything in those fermentation vats and do a first distillation of everything before you start a second distillation. Which means if this is 70 liters and that's 700 liters, you've got to do 10 of these to empty out that one vat. Wow. Okay? So after each first distillation in this, he's going to do another first distillation in the same still. So there's still going to be some leftover water in there, so he'll have to scoop out the water with a piece of either a cereal bowl, plastic, or a piece of gourd. You scoop out the water, and then there's still going to be that fiber in there, and most of the nutrients have come out of this. We've got to get rid of the fiber. So he'll use this pitchfork to pitch out the fiber, and then he's going to clean, so the bottom pot will be cleaned really, really well, and then he'll do another first distillation, and he'll keep on doing a first distillation and keep on emptying out the clay pot of the excess water and of the fiber. Okay? The fiber that comes out of there is the same fiber that's used over there to insulate the rocks from the piñas. This is used as compost. This is used as mulch. This is used to make adobe bricks. If you mix it with mud, sand, stones, donkey poo, cow poo, you have adobe bricks. We're going to have a whole bunch of plastic containers lined up with the single distilled mezcal called Xixe. It's not ready to drink yet. It can be, but it doesn't have the complexity of good mezcal, and it doesn't have the alcohol content of good mezcal. So you want to distill again. Okay. So second distillation, I'll have a whole bunch of these lined up with Xixe, the single distilled mezcal, and then we distill again. So we fill up the bottom pot with just Xixe, single distilled mezcal. We seal that to that, we seal that to that, start the water, and then our second distillation begins. Okay. Different alcohols are created at different temperatures, and an alcohol that's created at a relatively low temperature is methanol. And too much methanol isn't good for you. We all have methanol in our bodies, and it converts to formaldehyde, and that's something that we need. But if you're making a spirit in a first world country or a developing nation like Mexico, there's a standard. They don't want you to have too much methanol in your spirit. So it's an arbitrary standard. And in Mexico, you're not supposed to have more than 300 milligrams of methanol per 100 milliliters of liquid, of mezcal. Too much isn't going to hurt you, but there's a standard. It's an arbitrary standard. And if you're producing certified mezcal, you're going to send samples to the lab, and they're going to test it for acidity. They're going to test it for ABV, that it's what you're going to put on your label, and they're going to test it for methanol. And so when he became certified, the certification board assessed his operation, and they said, as long as you take off the first half liter or 3/4 of a liter that comes out of your still, that's your methanol, and then you're not going to have a problem getting it certified. So what he will do is but keep in mind that if you don't pass the standard, that doesn't mean you're going to get sick or you're going to go blind. There's a lot of fear-mongering. Part of it is from the president of the certification board, there was an article he was quoted several months ago, close to a year ago, in the New Yorker. It said, well, if you don't buy certified mezcal, it's fake mezcal, and you're going to die, and you're going to go blind.
Oh, jeez.
It's with all due respect, it's horseshit. Then you get rid of that. Then you let the good mezcal drip. And that's where you have the head, the body, and the tail. At the beginning of the second distillation, the mezcal is, so forget about the methanol. It's non-issue. Beginning of the distillation, the mezcal is really strong, and as the distillation progresses, the ABV, alcohol by volume, goes down. And there are names that are designated. The cabeza, the punta, or the head, is the first mezcal that comes out. It's too strong to drink. The tail end, or the cola, very, very weak mezcal, almost watery, and the taste can be a little bit off or bitter. And then the cuerpo is the middle section, the cuerpo, or the body. And that's around the ABV that you want, say between 42 and 53%, something like that. So at the end of the second distillation, he'll have a bunch of containers lined up filled with mezcal. At one end will be the strong mezcal. The other end will be the weak mezcal, the cola or the tail. And then there'll be the middle section. Everybody has a preferred ABV for their market. Around here, most people like their mezcal around 48. So how do you get 48? You take all of the middle section and add all of the cabeza, the head, stir it up, and then you slowly add back a little bit of the tail end to bring it down to 48. Okay? And the skill is bringing it down to the ABV for your market, but you don't want to put too much of that tail end in because the taste can be a bit off. Okay, and so that's the one way of making mezcal. Just using you get the ABV that you want using the liquid that comes out of the still. The other way is instead of using that tail, you use distilled water to bring it down, or mountain spring water to bring it down, or if it's a more industrialized operation, you'll use water from your filtration plant to bring it down, and that will help you to have a more consistent flavor from batch to batch because you know what you want in your filtered water from your filtration plant. So for the third distillation, you take your double distilled good mezcal and you distill it a third time. So you put it in there, you seal that to that, you seal that to that, and you start your third distillation. The only difference is dangling from this rope, you hang a raw chicken breast or turkey breast. So you've got your leaf, and then down here, you've got your chicken breast. So the steam rises up, passes over the protein before condensation, then it condenses, and that imparts a different flavor to your mezcal. So yes, those are 4 chicken breasts that used to be nice raw supple chicken breasts that were used to make the mezcal de pechuga that you're going to taste. Traditionally, mezcal de pechuga was reserved for special occasions. If you had a wedding, or a 15 años, or a baptism, or a confirmation, you would serve your guests something special, mezcal de pechuga. Now, mezcal de pechuga in the village is still used for that, but most of the mezcal de pechuga is exported because it's a way of distinguishing your mezcal from the competition's mezcal. For example, Pierre de Almas has a rabbit meat pechuga that sells in Washington State for $399 a bottle. And so he's got his rabbit meat, not in a clay still, I think it's in a copper still, and he's got a series of different fruits or herbs that's in the bottom still. So if you are making, for example, the mezcal de pechuga that you're going to taste in a few minutes, he dangles the raw chicken breast in there, and in the bottom pot he puts chopped up apple, orange, guava, apricot, pineapple, banana, cinnamon, raisins, rice, anise, and almonds.
Wow.
And a couple other things. And he puts those in the bottom pot. So the double distilled mezcal with all those fruits and herbs starts to boil, and it still passes over the breast before condensation. And if there's a little bit of fat on the chicken breast or chicken breast or whatever, that will drip back down and then come back up, and that's the process of making mezcal de pechuga. That bell-shaped thing, we seal the bottom pot to the bell with the paste that forms on top. Then there's a copper tube. You seal both ends of the copper tube with the paste and then plastic. And that end of the copper tube is attached to a copper serpentine immersed in a tank of water. Okay? So, the stuff in the bottom heats up and starts to boil. The steam rises, the steam goes across the copper, and as the steam goes down the serpentine, it condenses and mezcal comes out that end.
Yeah, that's got a secret going.
Pardon me?